Good morning, and welcome to the Museum of the San Ramon Valley's virtual speaker series. I'm Dan Dunn, the director of the museum. Last month, we escaped from Alcatraz with author David Crew. Today, the history of the Moraga Adobe. Built between 1841 and 1848, it is one of Northern California's oldest surviving adobe structures. The adobe provides a connection to one of the great and influential families in early California history and sheds light on the politics and society of the Rancho period. Kent Long, president of the Friends of the Joaquin Moraga Adobe, will give us an in-depth look at the adobe's long history, from the Mexican Rancho period through the American ranching period and into the 20th century. Kent will talk about the adobe's unique architecture, its initial restoration in the 1940s, and the current work to further restore it and open it as a museum. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome in Kent Long. Kent?
Well, thank you very much, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and be talking to a group from San Ramon. The Moraga Adobe is in Orinda, so not real far away, and yet not a lot of overlap sometimes in what people think of as local history. So very excited to perhaps tell you a few things you may not know about what's right here in Contra Costa along with you. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Hang on 1 second, please. Hang on, I've got too many windows here. I hope you can now see that. Sorry for the little interruption. So I am Kent Long, and I'm here from the Friends of the Joaquin Moraga Adobe. Our organization is a 501c3 nonprofit. How come my slide's not advancing here? There we go. We were formed in 2009, which, as you'll hear, was when the last remaining property around the Moraga Adobe was sold for the purpose of development. And that's what prompted our group to get started and try to do something. So our mission has been to acquire and preserve this 1841 Adobe and open it as a museum, a history and learning center. At 1841, this is the oldest surviving building in Contra Costa County and really much of the East Bay. You really have to go down as far as Mission San Jose in Fremont to find something that's older. And along with talking about this one building, we want to also, through our programs, enlighten people a little bit more about kind of a forgotten era in California history, this Rancho period during the Mexican era. A lot of people know about the missions, they know about Father Serra, and if you're in fourth grade history, you turn the page and the next thing it's the gold rush. And there's actually a few decades in there that we're still living with a lot of the influence today. And that's when these ranchos were formed. And so that's why we are particularly interested in bringing that to light for people. So where is the Moraga Adobe? I mentioned it's in Orinda, kind of on the south side. You won't be surprised to know it's on the border of the town of Moraga. So if you have sort of downtown Orinda, downtown Lafayette, and Moraga as a big triangle, the Adobe is sort of down in the southwest corner. That triangle pretty closely corresponds to the original rancho that was awarded to Joaquin Moraga and his cousin Juan Bernal. They petitioned the Mexican governor in 1835 for a 13,000 acre land grant, which is basically most things south of the freeway, all the way down through Moraga, and including Ream Valley, which is where all the redwoods grow. If you look at that in the context of the whole Bay Area, or the East Bay, you can see that it's quite a lot of the portion of Costa is made up with that one rancho. So you are probably thinking to yourselves, wow, I'd like to have 13,000 acres of Contra Costa real estate. How do you get a deal like that? Well, back then, it did depend who you are and who you knew. And so for that part of the story, we've got to go back a little bit before the Adobe. And this is when we'll learn a little bit more about the Moraga family and why they were in a position to receive a generous grant like that. So we'll go back to, I'm sorry here, you have to apologize for 1 second. I'm not seeing quite what I wanted on the screen here. Oh, come on now. Here we go. So we have to go back to July of 1776. I think everyone has a mental image about that historic month and what that means, and something that we can all have in common. So I'll forgive you if your mental image doesn't quite look like this one. This is a view of what was going on in July of 1776 in the where the San Francisco Presidio now is. In the center of this is Jose Joaquin Moraga. Now, Jose Joaquin Moraga is the grandfather of the Joaquin Moraga, whose house we're talking about today. It's very hard with all these names. They recycled a lot of names, and the families are intermarried. So family trees are often difficult to unravel. But this is the grandfather, Jose Joaquin Moraga, and he's shown leading an expedition to come up from Monterey to locate a site for the Presidio and for a mission up at the San Francisco harbor. Jose Joaquin Moraga was a lieutenant in the Spanish Army. He had been the second in command of the De Anza expedition. And many of you know that name. The De Anza expedition was the first real attempt by the Spanish government to bring civilian settlers up to Northern California. And between over the winter of 1775 to 1776, 240 or so men, women, and children walked from the Mexican-Arizona border all the way to Monterey. Monterey was the destination where they were going to establish more of a settlement. And Joaquin Moraga went on to choose the site for the Presidio and for the mission Dolores in San Francisco. And he also founded the town of San Jose. San Jose was kind of different in that it was a completely civilian settlement. All of the other towns in California, for the most part, were associated with either a Presidio, so a military establishment, or a mission. And it was a little bit different that they wanted to have a purely secular town. And San Jose was founded as that. And Jose Joaquin Moraga was also instrumental in finding that, and the site for Mission Santa Clara. And then he commanded the San Francisco Presidio until his death in 1785. And he's buried at Mission Dolores, and the plaque there. Jose Joaquin Moraga had a son who's also a important figure in the military settlements in California, Gabriel Moraga. Gabriel Moraga led many explorations in California's Central Valley in early 1800s. And many of the place names in the Central Valley and the Sierra foothills were assigned during these expeditions. If you're traveling on those back roads, or even some of the main cities, and something has a Spanish name, very good chance that that name may have been assigned during these early Moraga expeditions to the Central Valley. It was really uncharted territory for the Spanish back then. So these were first encounters in a lot of ways. Gabriel, in turn, had a son. And now this is the person whose house we're talking about today, Joaquin Moraga. He was born in the Soledad Mission. He was in the military for a while, but unlike his father and grandfather, that wasn't really his calling. And so he kind of fell out of the military, drifted a little bit, did get married at the tender age of 20 to a member of the Castro family. You'll keep seeing all these family names. Many of these came up on the De Anza expedition. The Castros, the Pachecos, the Peraltas. Many of these families have came then and stayed. They're like the Bay Area equivalent of coming on the Mayflower, basically. But Gabriel Moraga finds more of his interest in ranching. And so he begins ranching in the 1820s and was put in charge of all of the cattle herds at Mission San Jose. This is the time the missions are kind of in decline. The Mexicans did not support the missions the same way the Spanish had. So it was a much more difficult time for people just to say, "Oh, I'm just going to stay at the mission and life will be comfortable." It was kind of eking out an existence a lot of time. But the ranching was something that was catching on more and more because there was actually some a important hide trade that was starting between California and the East Coast. You talk about cattle ranching, you think of beef, you think of In-N-Out Burger and a thick sirloin, but back then there were only 8,000 people in California and 1 million cattle. So it was not for the locals to eat. Almost all of the cows were raised for their hides and for the tallow that was a sort of a byproduct, but for the leather. The picture here on the right shows men carrying sacks of hides out to a waiting boat that will take them out to a larger boat, which will ultimately take these things back to the East Coast. This is a model, a cross-section model they have down at the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum showing how these boats were just stacked with leather hides. And then they would slip in more, just like you'd stick another piece of paper into a stack on your desk. And then finally, the ships would be so full after a year or even almost 2 of going up and down the coast collecting these hides, they would finally make the trip back around the Horn to Boston in particular, where there was a lot of leather making. So these hides might then come back on a different boat the next year as shoes or a belt or something like that. This was really the main contact between what we think of as the US, the East Coast, and California. Up until the gold rush, it was really, one of the most remote places on Earth, is the bottom line. Anyway, so in 1835, the Joaquin Moraga and his cousin had applied for this land grant. Only takes 6 years of red tape back then. So the land grant became final in 1841. Joaquin found a site for building a house. It was up on a hill with a nice commanding view of the valley. This is 13,000 acres. You have to have a way to keep track of what's going on with it. And this was an excellent location for that. Originally were 2 adobe rooms with almost 3 foot or about 3 foot thick walls on the outside and 2 foot thick walls on the inside. The beams and the floor were built from local redwood. I'd mentioned how the town of Canyon, the area of Canyon, was part of this rancho. So they were able to cut down local redwood trees, which gave them a distinct advantage over many of the local building conditions. And they did use Indian labor to help make the bricks and build the walls. And we're trying to understand a little bit more of those dynamics. By this time, the Indians and the Mexicans had largely reached a kind of an equilibrium. So it seems like it was actually a pretty interesting relationship and not what you might imagine, I guess, in a lot of ways. So that 1841, 2 rooms, 1848, the family wants to move in. It's getting a little too crowded. They expand the adobe with 3 more adobe rooms. So this is this will be a cumulative floor plan. So not all of this is here yet, but I just want to build this up over time. So the green down here represents those first two Adobe rooms that were built in 1841. And then, so you had that, and then the other feature is a wraparound porch that goes all the way around. It's a covered porch that comes out. And then, as I mentioned, shortly thereafter, they added 3 more Adobe rooms in the back. And so this is what we refer to as the 1848 floor plan. And this, as a spoiler, is what we are going back to today. So the additional things that we'll talk about later are no longer there. This 1848 is really what we are currently restoring. You know about some of this from this piece of paper, which was drawn probably in the 1870s, maybe 1880s, early 1880s, by the granddaughter, Ella Moraga, who did this diagram of the Adobe, and you can see it has the 3, not entirely to scale, 3 rooms across the back. The kitchen is outdoors. In general, in these Adobe houses, all cooking was done outdoors. They might come inside to eat, but there would be an outside, one of those beehive Horno type ovens. It's most typical. This talks about a few things, the details of the construction. And it says it cost $9,000 back in the 1840s. That's not a trivial thing. Some other little details here about the garden and these the pickets are made by hand from redwood trees on the ranch. These little details like that we have to work with. So this has actually been an important document in a lot of this. I'll point out one more thing, talking about the Indians, is this is servants' room on each side. The Indians were kind of the servants, there's no doubt about that, but here they are, they're living, I mean, not in the house with everyone, but they're right on the covered porch living. When you go up there, you realize that's a cozy relationship. These are not putting someone out at arm's length so much as, yeah, it's not the best accommodations, but you're right here literally under the same roof with the family. So a lot of, there's a lot to learn. Life on the rancho, it's a cattle ranch. If you've been on a cattle ranch today, it's not all that different. There's a lot of waiting around for the cows to graze, and then it's roundup time, and you have to go out and bring them down for, in this case, slaughter for their hides. But it's basically the same exercise as still goes through today. The caballeros the cowboys were often of heavily Indian mixed ancestry. This was a real merit society, at least in terms of the horsemanship. If you could ride a horse and you could rope a steer, and especially if you could train a horse, you were a valuable employee. And sometimes the Indian caballeros would run off, maybe with a horse that they trained, and go get a ranch on a different rancho, or go get a job on a different rancho. So they were actually prized skills back then, the horsemanship, and by all accounts were some of the greatest horsemen that anyone had ever seen. There were many, many descriptions of people being awed by what the Mexicans could do on horseback. But it was a real work hard, play hard kind of society, and they loved their fandangos. Fandangos were big multi-day dance and music parties where a family would go over to the neighboring ranch and spend the weekend, and then decide maybe that wasn't enough and spend another couple of days. And they'd drink and they'd sing songs and they'd gamble and they would dance. And the Moraga's Adobe was particularly popular because of that wooden floor that they had. Most Adobes just had a packed dirt floor. And for dancing, it was definitely not as nice as a nice clean wood floor. If you're dancing all night on a dirt floor, that room's going to have a lot of dust in it. So this picture shows a more elaborate fandango, to be fair. This is hanging in the Santa Barbara courthouse between 2 of the courtrooms. And it's a huge painting, and it's indicating what an important part of the social world these fandangos really were. So now you're thinking, wow, I've got my 13,000 acres. I got skilled horsemen working the ranch. I've got parties on the weekend with my friends. So that and I'm off here in this distant part of the world where no one's going to bother me. So the Moragas have really got it made at this point. I think we would all agree that's a life we might want to settle down and explore. But things weren't stay that way. Only 40 or so miles away as the crow flies, while the Adobe is still being built, there's trouble up at Sonoma Mission, and we have the beginnings of the red flag, the bear flag revolt, right? And in only about a year and a half after this event, it's all over. The Mexican-American War has been fought. California has been ceded to the United States by Mexico. We're just this year marking the 175th anniversary of the treaty that made California part of the U.S. And so now this Adobe that was built in Mexico is suddenly in the United States. That's a trick question I use on school kids. Like, this building was built in the 1840s in Mexico, and here it is in Orinda, and it's never been moved. And I let them ponder that for a little while. But anyway, so huge change, right? So this is, you think this has got to be the biggest change of the biggest change of the decade, maybe the biggest change of the century in terms of how this has all been for the Moragas and his family and their connections and all of that. It turns out this was not even the biggest event of these 2 weeks, because just a week or two before this treaty was signed, 100 miles from the Adobe, a man saw a shiny rock in a ditch. This is James Marshall. He's standing in the sluice at Sutter's Mill, and he is just discovered gold. I like the guy in the background. To me, he's going to rush over and he's going to start the gold rush. There's something about that he's the first one to witness it. But the more came. So this remote part of the world, the Moragas they were going to have company very shortly. By the next year, this is San Francisco Harbor. All of these ships have been abandoned by their crews and their captains. And they have literally head for the hills. This picture is probably taken, around Chinatown near the Trans-American Pyramid, probably. All that, what's now landfill down Battery Street, Embarcadero Center, that's where these ships are. So obviously, a huge influx of people. They're all traipsing through, not so much lingering in Contra Costa, but they're traipsing through. And there's a lot more influence by the Americans. But the most critical thing is all of these ranchos had to be defended in US courts. And that was kind of a watershed change for most of these ranchos. This map's a little odd. North is kind of off to the left. Here's the triangular ranches we've been talking about. So Lafayette, Moraga. Walnut Creek and San Ramon will be a little bit off the map here. This shows the East Bay of Oakland and Berkeley. And so this is the huge Peralta here, the Peralta family. And on either side of that, you have ranchos in San Lorenzo and up in Richmond, the Castro family. Not surprisingly, Castro Valley. Yeah, right? All of these families had to go to court. All of these families were challenged because largely they've been in a Spanish-speaking culture, and many of them were not even that literate in Spanish, and much less in English, and they had to go in and defend themselves in court. But luckily, back when the ranchos were, when the petition for the rancho, the Moragas had to submit a map. So they had a map of this 13,000 acre rancho here. So that was what was submitted to the court proceedings to document all of the land borders. And this is the map that the Moragas had. This was called the diseño, which was a requirement for each of these ranchos. And this is pretty typical of what you would get, what you'd have to submit for 5, 10, 20,000 acres. You'd have a little map like this that would kind of show where the hills were and maybe a creek or two. And indeed, that's what they had. They had another map too. I'm not sure this really helped them that much. Both of these are at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, by the way. So these are what they had to work with. And it was an uphill battle. Beyond this, they had squatters coming in and settling, especially down where the redwood trees were. They sold that off early because they couldn't defend it against the squatters. They finally got the land grant ratified in 1855, and Joaquin Moraga died just a few months later. So he actually spent out his waning years trying to, pay lawyers and defend his land grant. But he's now buried at Mission Dolores along with his grandfather. So every story needs a villain, and in this story, this guy is usually the villain. Horace Carpentier. Horace Carpentier was the first mayor of Oakland. He was a prominent, we'll use that word, prominent lawyer in the East Bay. And he basically carved out a very lucrative niche for himself, defending these rancho families in court. Now, the rancho families, they had been working in hides and ranch hand wages to pay out, and also it was not a very cash-intensive operation. So he would generally take his payment in land. And so a little bit here, a little bit there. We won't cover all of these. They go on and on about piecing it together. The bottom line is what it says there. By the 1880s, the Moraga family is out. They have had to sell off every bit of the 13,000 acres. And along the line, Horace Carpentier had been buying up either directly as his fees, or he'd been buying up when it went on the market. And so basically he reconstructed most of that rancho and then split. He sold it off, moved back to Columbia University, was a huge benefactor back there. There's a Carpentier Hall, I believe. It's so he's a villain on the West Coast and a hero in New York City. I don't know if there's any parallels in that, but you can draw your own conclusions. But so Horace Carpentier was really how the Moragas got away from the rancho. After him, it changed hands a couple of times. In the 1900s, it was basically just run as a dairy. The Adobe had no one living in it and was allowed to deteriorate. It's a glorified pile of mud. If you leave it out in the rain without a roof, things aren't going to last. That's exactly what was going on. And it was condemned by the county at one point, even to be used as a barn, although that seemed to be largely ignored. But and it was really just used for livestock and storage. So here's one of the residents of the time. This is the oldest photo we have of the Moraga Adobe, 1922. And this is showing one of those two original Adobe rooms. And you can see there's a stairway going up to an attic space, and that was always there as well. In the back, you can see about the same time, these are those three little rooms that were added in the back a little later. They weren't done as well. They haven't held up as well. So they are really kind of falling apart, even here in the early 1920s. But you can see why they chose this spot. I mean, here before all the subdivisions and people planted trees in their yards. Now, if you looked at this part of Orinda, it's all wooded. But then you can see it was just grassland, and they really did have a commanding view. Turn and look the other way toward the town of Moraga, and you can see St. Mary's College there in the distance, right here, and then of course Mount Diablo. Definitely a beautiful spot. Just looking back at the Adobe is we were just up here on the hill looking, and so this is looking back the way this is. Things continue to deteriorate. By the 1830s, things are definitely on their way out, and days seem numbered for the Adobe. You can see the porch is now gone. The supports for the roof are gone, and definitely. You notice the moldings here. I just want to stop it. I didn't finish this earlier, but we've just learned that this Adobe is there's something called the Monterey colonial style of Adobes, and this is just sort of emerging as an architectural theme. And we've been talking to a professor down at Cal State Monterey, and this is original. These are the things that the Mexicans wanted to be about the Americans. So when they could when they started having machine moldings showing up for trading in San Francisco, they would buy them. They would add them on to their kind of primitive Adobe. So as incongruous as this looks, That is actually the way the Moragas had it. And here you can kind of see, I said it's on its last legs, and here most of the walls in the back are gone. These are those three little rooms again. You can see a sort of cellar that's there or something. Not long for this world, except for this lady. This is Catherine Irvine. Catherine Irvine was the matriarch of the Irvine family. And at that point, the Irvine Company was the descendant of where Carpentier had sold it off, and there was something called the Utah Company for a while, and now the Irvine Company owns most of Moraga and the southern part of Orinda. And Catherine Irvine takes an interest in this old adobe. And so coincidentally or not, around the 100th anniversary of its original construction in 1941, she embarks on a major renovation. And you may have seen this picture. I think this was the picture in the waiting room when we were before the talk today. But this is the work that was going on in the 1940s. And so these are, again, those three back rooms that were added. And you can see they had to be largely removed, but there are stubs of the wall. But those beyond that, what is still standing there are those first two rooms. And those are really, those have really survived. At this time, they expanded the house. They turned it into more of a modern suburban house by adding on bedrooms to what are the two corners toward us right here. And they put an indoor kitchen, imagine that, and little niceties like that to make it more ready for suburban life in the 40s and 50s. After the renovation, this is what the outside looked like. Definitely the nicest it had ever been. They stuccoed the outside. Back in the day, they probably would have been smeared with mud periodically, but they put on a kind of cement-based stucco. And this is kind of still the look today. Now we're up to the 1940s. So this is the maximum floor plan for the adobe. So we had original two rooms. We had these three rooms that were added. And now we've had these wood frame additions to add a master bedroom and more bedrooms over here. This one room was just turned into a hallway and a large master bath. So this was how the adobe stayed until our project started just some recent years. In the 60s, a little more renovation. This house was featured in the San Francisco Chronicle Sunday Home section. So this is what suburban living in a then 125-year-old adobe was like. You can see they put in a fireplace, which is not original. The Moragas, like most families, would just bring in hot coals in a kettle, and that's what they would use for warmth. The adobe walls do a good job of staying warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. Looking the other way, this is again still in the main, one of those original two 1841 rooms, and this is 1841 room beyond it. You can see the redwood floor is gone. Now it has a tiled floor, but and then this kitchen was added here. This doesn't do it. Black and white does not do its justice. This is bright orange paint. This is absolutely pure 60s motif in here, but definitely a period piece. The 1960s was the closest the adobe ever came to being open. The Manuel family that owned it, Don Manuel was the head of the Moraga Historical Society, and he would have an open house every year and invite the whole town to come up. So many people have fond memories of back then being able to go through the adobe, and relatively few ever since. So that's part of what we're trying to correct. And the adobe's been recognized at the state, national, and local level. It's a state historic landmark since 1954. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. And then after Orinda incorporated as a city, it became a City of Orinda landmark. That's a picture of the state historic plaque. Like it says, stolen 2010 from the front of the adobe, along with the city landmark plaque. So that was one of the early shame things we felt bad about. It's like, oh, gee, and they were never recovered. But I am very pleased and excited to say that we received a grant, a generous grant from a local chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Acalanes chapter, to replace these plaques. And later today, we will be picking up the replacements to go on the newly refurbished Adobe. So thank you to DAR, but there's a happier twist to this slide, even in the last 24 hours. So after the last family moved out in the early 2000s, the Adobe sat unoccupied, and there started to be a lot of break-ins and teenage parties and vandalism. And during that time is when the Adobe was sold. So the 20 acres around it and the Adobe were sold off for the purpose of building a new subdivision. That time, we decided, I was active with the Orinda Historical Society at the time, but we decided we needed to have an independent group focused on the Moraga Adobe. So this was the inaugural meeting, oh my God, almost 15 years ago, held to discuss what those options could be. The lady here on the right is Bobby Landers, a real matriarch in Orinda, and one of the first town council members when we incorporated. Were the then mayors of Moraga and Orinda, who also attended that first meeting. So it was definitely a project that from the get-go had high level awareness and support. And that's something that we have definitely benefited from. It's our first time inside the Adobe as a group to see what can go on. That's one of the representatives from J&J Ranch, the developers, who's leading us around. With the outside looked at that time, you can see a stairway going up to the attic there and that front covered porch. And then, although it was pretty in that last picture, the graffiti started to become more and more pervasive, and you can sort of see, time ticking away. So during this time, we're working with the developers. We're trying to work out a plan where we could buy the building, save the building, open it up as a museum, any of the above, rather than just see it deteriorate or just be a clubhouse for the homeowners. That was the default plan, and we didn't really think that was enough. So after several years of trying fits and starts, we did reach an agreement with the J&J Ranch partners. So this is us up at the Adobe 10 plus years ago, agreement in hand. And that's what we're still operating under today. Basically, we are able to purchase the Adobe and 2+ acres around it for $500,000. That's basically positioned as our half of the restoration cost. In reality, the restoration has been more than 1 million, so it's less than half of what the total has been. But that's what our group is doing. We've raised the $500,000, and we have been waiting for the project to complete. Part of the approval by the city is that the restoration has to be done before it can be transferred to us or anyone else. The city was very concerned about the Adobe, getting its attention and having a new lease on life. This parcel is, like I say, is part of 20 acres. So this is Moraga Way. Orinda is to our right. Moraga is to our left. This is Del Rey Elementary School, but Miramati High School would be just to the left out of the picture, if you know where Miramati is. And up on the hill here, the Adobe is sort of up here at the top, and we have the hillside below, great view. And then these are other home sites, and there are indeed 13 other houses that are going in around us. So after we had our agreement and we said, like, okay, we're going to start working on the project, the restoration planning started in earnest. So we had the first architectural inspections in 2016. You can see the graffiti. I mean, some of it admittedly not unartistic, but nevertheless not welcome and not what you want to see. It's showing what life in the 1840s was like. This is the guy here in the middle is Mike Garavaglia. He's the lead preservation architect on the project. This is his first time inside the Adobe. And his body language, I think, says like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? In reality, he's been great on the project. But you can kind of see this was the situation at that time. See how deep the walls are here. He's looking outside at some of the original Adobe bricks. There's some here that appears to have like horsehair in the sample. confirm whether that is in fact what it is. Could be some kind of plant, but reinforcing the mud with what was available was pretty much the building technique. Here you can get a good idea of the size of these bricks. Up in the attic, the roof is, I almost said attached. It's more the roof sits on these Adobe walls. You can see these sleepers coming out, and the wall and the roof just sits on those with these wood pins holding it down. So very interesting construction up there. The rehabilitation plan, as I mentioned, is to get back to that 5-room footprint. Redwood floor back in there, since that's part of the lore, and then plan for outdoor area for school groups to come through, and then a support building with new bathrooms and all that. And this plan was approved in 2017. This is up there, us putting a deposit down on the purchase plan. So this starts a 3-year window. We had to raise the money. And at the same time, this is kicking off the real construction of the subdivision that's up there. But you can still see the views. Here's Mount Diablo. Here's out to Las Trampas and Rocky Ridge out here. So San Ramon Valley would be just the other side of Las Trampas Ridge right here. The real work on the Adobe proper started a little over 3 years ago, in September of 2020. And the first thing that happened was removing those 1940s additions and the extra basement that had been dug. So this is where one of those wood frame additions has been removed. And now we're back to the 1848 footprint. And you can kind of see where there's the old Adobe up here, and this is what was done in the 1940s. It was still Adobe of its time, more modern version. Inside the Adobe, you can kind of chiseling away at the floor revealed, oh, there's not much space under here. So the plans for the redwood floor had to be revised to be a little less bouncy than what we had envisioned, but nevertheless, it's in. You'll see that. Here's where you can see that transition between the 1840s Adobe construction and the 1940s construction on the outside. And here, all the porch work has been removed too. Some of it was repaired, and some of it had to be replaced. After about 2.5 years of that 3-year window, we did cross the 500,000 fundraising mark, which means we knew we were going to turn it into a museum, and we can start planning accordingly. We don't have to hedge our bets that, oh, maybe it'll only be a clubhouse after all. So we were able to make some changes for historic accuracy, changes for visitor flow, a lot of things that are better for us, that we were able to get started early since we reached the deadline a little bit early. So our plan is to create a museum showing how the Moraga family lived, but also how other families, like I say, all these families went through the same kinds of experiences. And really just talk about this Rancho period and how these, that we're living with the names, we're living with the city limit lines that were drawn then. All of these things about land in California are really still inherited from the Rancho period more than any other era. And we especially expect to have 4th grade school groups up there. California history is a prime demographic for us, but we also want to provide a venue for garden groups to come up and have a demonstration garden, scout groups, other kinds of volunteer groups. So we really want to be a community resource. This is how we're going to allocate our 5 rooms. We're going to have 3 of them, the one shown here in green, furnished like the 1840s, with and pretty sparse furnishings, as the way those usually were. And then we'll have 2 rooms over here that are more true museum type rooms, one with permanent displays, maps, story of the Dianza expedition, talking about these other families, a lot packed into this one big room. And we'll have another room that can be more rotating exhibits, where we'd like to have, it has a sort of an art gallery feel, so we can picture art exhibits, but other kinds of historical exhibits as well. Things that are related, but maybe not with as strictly a theme. It may not be part of the California or the Rancho period, but something else that would be of interest to people who would be interested in it. So someone will come in the front door, again, the front door where this porch is, spend a little trip to the 1840s, come into sort of learn a little bit more in the museum room, see some special exhibit, rotating thing, and then exit out to a courtyard where we'll have activity areas. The period furnishings, something along these lines. We're working on it right now. They can go pretty elaborate, they go pretty Spartan. We'll be somewhere in between. Notice the dirt floor in this one though, which is more typical of Adobe's, but luckily we have a regular floor. Bedroom is something that we are particularly furnishing out based on descriptions. We have an author that wrote a description went to a New Year's Eve party in 1855 at the Adobe and wrote descriptions of the building, wrote descriptions of the people and how they were interacting. Another example of the Indian relations, he's talking about how the Indian kids are running around with the family. I mean, they're like just part of it. So very, very descriptive, but he talks about how there's 2 beds in the bedroom with canopies. He talks about how there's a timepiece in the main room. Details like that we're using as a lot of guidance. These are kind of our museum rooms. We have a big room, one of those original 2, and then we have the exhibit room, which is one of the 3 that were added. Inside, this is the main room again. We're leaving this section of Adobe bricks exposed so that people can see. On the outside, this is sort of artist concept, not particularly likely. This is the plan that we're actually working on. A little bit down in this corner is still getting worked out, but we have a little parking area. We have pathways coming around. It's a little awkward. The veranda is on the far side from the street, so you kind of have to come around to come in the front door. But that's the layout that we will have. We also have this whole hillside not shown down here. We have a walking path down toward that elementary school, so we have a way for people to come on. Outdoors, we plan to have a demonstration oven, an area for kids to do projects, whatnot. Here's an example of a change we made once we knew it was going to be a museum and historic accuracy was a premium. We changed the plan for this. You may recall there was a stairway along the side of the building versus the ladders that the Moragas would have had. So now the attic access is being just a ladder. This is a very similar Adobe down in Salinas, the brown Adobe. You can see how it has a door that you would use a ladder to get up to and just a hole in the roof to get up. Ours is more a slot. Also, are in the process of commissioning a reproduction of this saddle. This saddle was made in 1855 in San Francisco for the Moraga family. It's now in the Autry Museum down at Griffith Park in Los Angeles. But we are having an exact replica of this made, and then this will be on display in the Adobe. And we want this to be a hands-on kind of museum. So we want kids to be able to climb up and sit on the saddle. We want kids to lay down on the. We want really it to be a feel for the era kind of experience. Also doing more research. This is a tax bill from 1855 that gives how many head of cattle and all these sorts of things. There's a lot out there that's still not really fully uncovered about the Moraga family. So I just have like a bunch of pictures that show kind of the current state of things. Last year, we got the new roof on, so it is a heavily fire retardant shake roof. So everyone says, "Oh my God, how did you do that?" By calling in every favor with the fire department that we could. We got a wood roof. We got no slack on anything else. But we did get the wood roof because that is a historic detail. Here you can kind of see the view of Mount Diablo in the background and the area around it. This is the Adobe parcel from above, their little parking and the viewpoint type area, and then the hillside going down. We have a new little support building with storage and restrooms. And this is that lower hillside where we ultimately plan to have a walking path that would go down and connect near that elementary school at the bottom of the hill. The trim has either been fixed or reproduced. So we have trim that matches what the Moragas had back in the day. New stucco put on the outside. And this is, so now we get a pretty close to final. In this picture, you don't have the wooden decking on yet, but other than that, the outside pretty close. Inside, we have redwood. This is reclaimed old growth redwood from somewhere up the coast. It's a barn that's being used as our flooring in here throughout all of the rooms. as well as on the porch outside. The porch here is, you can tell from the concrete, this has had to be reconstructed to be a little bit more support, but it looks, you won't know it when you see it. Inside, you see those redwood floors again, and thickness of the walls, and the wonderful woodwork that's been done to reproduce a lot of things in here. Outside, these are like the last few weeks, had concrete pathways poured, and we also had a bunch of trees removed. So now the view across the valley has really been opened up, and you can see you see Mount Diablo from the front porch of the Adobe once again. It's one of the descriptions everyone says is that you sit on the porch and you look at the mountain. And then this is this is just a couple of weeks ago. So here you can see those pathways going in. Here we're going to have a viewpoint, and this is a very, very nice spot. And that's large. If you went there today, this is what you would see. You'd see landscaping missing, but otherwise pretty complete. So what's next? I mentioned that the restoration has to be complete before the purchase can go through. This is now scheduled for next month. You are the first group to hear me say that, because this is breaking news. We were meeting with the developers yesterday at the Adobe. So I'm very excited to be able to say that definitively, that we are planning to close in December. The landscaping is still going to be a little bit of a work in progress for some months after that, but we will have a public opening in 2024. Whether we can get fully up and running with programs may depend on use permits and a few other little things like that. But you'll have a chance to visit the Adobe in 2024, I promise you. And this has really opened up a lot of new opportunities for us on the volunteer side to outfit this museum. I mean, you can see it's pretty empty, but there's some very interesting research going on to figure out the right kind of furnishings. We have some reproductions being made. We have other reproductions that we'd like to see made. So if any of those things are of interest, we will have something for you to do up there. Well, I call this talk a new beginning. It's almost like a third beginning for the Moraga Adobe. There was when the Moragas built it. There was when the Irvines saved it. And now hopefully we're saving it again and setting the stage for it to be something that more and more people can enjoy. It is the oldest building in the East Bay. That alone, I think, makes it important. But we really think it can be a resource, and I hope it's something that you all will want to come and visit. So how can you help? Sure, we take donations. We raise the money, but we can see there's still a lot ahead of us. So we'll definitely always appreciate that. We are selling personalized little paver bricks that'll be put in that viewpoint area. So that's a way to, it's not quite an Adobe brick, but you can have a brick at the Adobe. So that's a way that's been very popular type thing for us. Volunteer options, we've got lots. Just let me know if that interests you at all. But the main thing is why I'm talking to you here today is just to spread the word. I am excited to be getting a little bit beyond Orinda, Moraga, Lafayette, and talking about what we've been doing and hopefully what we can do in the future. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. I know we have a couple of questions, so I'll look forward to taking those. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. I think one of the things we need to figure out, at least from the museum's point of view, is whenever we get a slide of Horace Carpentier up, I need to have like a button that I can put in a boo or hiss soundtrack. He's one of the great villains of this area.
It's really true. And I like I say, I'm very struck by how it's so much the opposite case back at Columbia. He's like, one of their historic, important supporters. So it's all in the line.
Let's turn our back on the villains for a little while and get back to the good guys. So how you were a member of the Orinda Historical Society. How did you get involved in this project?
Yeah, so I grew up in Orinda, and I remember when I was 10 or 12, a book called The History of Orinda came out, and I opened it up, and in almost the first page, there's this picture, one of the pictures I showed you earlier of the 1930s decaying Adobe. There's this picture, it's Moraga Adobe right here in Orinda. Who knew? And it kind of stuck in my craw a little bit. And, but I never went up there. I'd never seen it. And then many years later, my wife also grew up here in Orinda. We moved back to Orinda to raise our kids and got involved with the local historical society, and was on their board working as their archivist when the Moraga Adobe property changed hands. And so I went over there the first day saying, well, I've always wanted to go see the Moraga Adobe. And, I was sort of the de facto photographer for the historical sites. Well, I'll just go there and take some pictures. So I went over there in the fall of 2008 to take some pictures, and here I still am. So it was just one of these things that it seems like an important building. It seemed like a project that should happen. I could sense there was support, but yet, someone's got to kind of step up and do it. And I don't know. At one of those meetings, they said, "Oh, we need to have a president," and I didn't step backwards as fast as everyone else. I think that's the bottom line.
Yeah, so many organizations are run the exact same way. So
it's really been a pleasure to do it, and it's been for me. I mean, I'm interested in the history and the saving of it, but there was a lot of business negotiations and planning commission hearings and a lot of things that were, we're getting to the fun stuff now. Let me just put it that way.
Well, yeah, and congratulations on, some of the before and after pictures are remarkable, especially from the period when it was subject to the amount of graffiti and vandalism, to what you've got today, which is spectacular. And congratulations on picking up the plaques to go back up today. That's a big deal. Our two buildings are on the National Register, and I know what those plaques mean when you get them put up. So what was the decision-making process? I think I could probably answer this one, but to get back to a period where you said to yourselves, this is the period that we're going to go restore back to. In other words, the 1848 period. What was the decision process like?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I can see different scenarios where we might have ended up with something different. By the time our group got involved, or by the time our group formed, the subdivision plans were already gelling. I mean, they were kind of already starting to. That was the default way that things were going to go. So it was. I would have liked to have had 5 years more warning and a bigger thing, and maybe we could have raised $5 million and bought all 20 acres or something like that. And I think if we would have done that, then maybe we would have done a different kind of park, because there was an interesting old barn on the property, and the wood frame additions from the 1940s, they could have been left maybe, or something like that. But in part, we knew we were only going to have an acre or two to work with, and the historic part of the building, the part that's described in all of the landmark designations, are those adobe walls, and that just seemed in some ways the most coherent story we could tell was if it was really focused on the Moragas and not so much trying to explain everything that happened after, because it can get out of hand. Down in Pleasanton, they've got a kind of a similar situation with the Alviso Adobe, which was turned into a dairy and has 20th century buildings on it, and they've retained more of the ranch feel there. But basically the historic barn building got torn down pretty early in the process up here, and it just seemed like that was the cleanest thing for us to do, and I think it was the right decision. I mean, I like I said, I'd love to have more than the 2 acres, but we can work with that. I mean, and now we're neighbors with nice, beautiful, I don't even call them mini mansions. Some of them are legitimately big houses, but it's okay. We're optimizing for our views. We've had, back in part of the negotiation, one of the things I didn't mention was lowering the roof lines for a couple of the other lots so that they wouldn't obstruct our view. So I think it'll be a good experience for people to come up there. But
Okay.
it could have gone it would differently.
Couple nuts and bolts questions, and then we'll also talk about the educational components that you're looking at. So a couple questions came in about the stucco. Is that kind of an original reproduction kind of thing? What about the protection from vandalism? Although it sounds like the neighborhood's building around you, so that won't be as isolated as it was.
Yeah,
And
well,
then one
those
from
are
me,
both really good questions.
and then one from me. If I'm reading the building properly, it looks like you were able to either save or reproduce a lot of the moldings. And I found the moldings interesting because you would, not sure I would imagine automatically that moldings would find its way onto an Adobe kind of building.
Yeah, well, that's really true. It's surprising to me, and in fact, one of our board members and of our founding members is a direct descendant of the Moraga family. His he talks about his great grandmother being born at the Adobe, I think it was.
Oh.
But he was convinced that those couldn't have been original. Like, oh, that's something we're going to get rid of to go back to the way his family would have had it and all this sort of thing. And then like I say, we've been in touch with this Ruben Mendoza, who's a professor at Cal State Monterey, and he's saying, "Oh no, that's the Monterey colonial style."
Wow.
And indeed, we went to this Baranda Adobe in Salinas, which I would recommend to anyone. It's only a mile off the freeway, and same sort of thing. It's very much all of that. In terms of what we have now, we don't know how much of the 1840s original survived the 1940s redo, but we've been treating all of the stuff that we have now as, quote, original. So a lot of it has been repaired and put back up, and that's true both inside and outside. And then for the ones that couldn't be repaired, they had custom knives cut to match the contour of the moldings, and then made new custom moldings to match. So some are new, but they are exact reproductions of that. In terms of the stucco, yeah, good eyes, whoever asked that question. What would have been authentic back in the days of the Moraga is they would typically have they'd have the Adobe bricks, and then they would periodically, every year or two, smear mud on the bricks, much like a stucco finish. So sort of a hard shell finish, but not as durable as something that would be cement-based. And then they would take a limestone-based solution and they would whitewash that. So the white stucco look is actually pretty close, but the materials are different. Now, in our case, the Adobe got stuccoed in the 1940s. So on top of the bricks, so like in that part that's right in the backdrop behind my picture here, that got chicken wired and stuccoed over. Now we had debates, and we meaning with the preservation architect and all of this, like, what do we do about all of this? And it was deemed so risky to try to remove the stucco at this point that it could really start just pulling out chunks of brick with it. Plus, at a practical level, I don't know how your volunteer situation is, but if we had to have an annual work party to go smear mud on the Adobe, it might be a tough sell.
Yeah.
So at a practical maintenance level, the stucco made sense. And since it had already been changed, it made sense to leave it. So that's true inside and out. I kind of glossed over the one picture I had that showed it, but one of those interior pictures did show how we have a window frame around a section of the Adobe bricks.
Mm-hmm.
And the window frame there is made from some of the other windows that couldn't be reused. So those are at least 1940s original window pieces that are the frame now for the, our carpenter calls it a truth window. I didn't know that term, but where you can see the bricks inside.
And then for the vandalism question, as I said, it looks like you've got a neighborhood being built in around.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's, you know, I'll tell you, I worry every time I go up there because I've seen it, and you know, I'm not naive enough to believe that, oh, none of those kids were from Orinda doing that. They must have come from, you know,
Those
over the hill
out
or
of towners.
you know, I've heard enough lore from meeting Orinda kids saying, "Oh, the Adobe, yeah, I know the Adobe." So I really hope that that has changed. Basically, since the other houses have been going in, we have not had a problem. We did have ongoing problems, though, even during, like, when the rest of the subdivision was starting to go in, before the work started proper on the Adobe, that they'd want to be showing lots to potential homeowners, and they had to keep painting over the graffiti on the Adobe.
Yeah,
yeah. The neighborhood looked bad. We don't have that now. If it happens, then we'll probably have to, you know, paint over it, to be honest. And then right now we have kind of an unfinished Adobe finish on the outside. That's I hope that's not wishful thinking, but
so then a couple other things that I kind of lump into the Adobe education kind of category. One of our visitors recommended, or one of our viewers recommended, Casa Adobe, which is in Glenwood. She suggested that might be not a bad place to look for interior views of what a typical Adobe interior would look like. And then the question, and I kind of had this one too, because it's a period, I'm from the East Coast and we know nothing about this. The Rancho period, and how you envision talking about the Rancho period with the families and the native population. I know you had your reproduction saddle that you're looking at. So can you talk a little bit about what the educational philosophy is for that Rancho period, and mentioning the native population as well?
yeah, absolutely. Well, like I say, that's really where we, beyond just the, you know, this old building, that's where we see kind of a niche for us to do historical education like that. Basically, you know, from, if you want to put years around it, something like 1820 to 1860 is sort of that lost era. Obviously, the gold rush part's not lost, but some of the other, you know, impact has been largely. You know, there's a lot. Like I said earlier, the Rancho period and the land use today is still so intertwined. I think maps are going to help make people feel a lot of that connection is part of it. Maybe I'm biased. My dad was in the title insurance business, and I remember him talking about the ranchos and the land grants and all of this, and it was a, you know, it was a real deep history that he had to get into to even understand what the modern day borders were and all of that. So, you know, there's that, and like I say, I think talking about some of these families and what they went through going into the courts, we plan to have, you know, a little bit of high tech stuff because we don't have that much space. We envision having some kind of like a kiosk where someone can select a menu and then watch either a short video or see like a slideshow on a particular thing. That second museum room has a nice corner that will probably have a big screen where we can show like a more of a film, but we also are picturing a little bit more of like a walk up and learn something station or two inside that museum room. We do have some other artifacts we're planning to have in there. We'll probably have, you know, an Indian grinding rock and the usual kind of stuff like that. The Indian relations, that's more a research project for me personally, to be quite honest, because the deeper I get into this, the more questions I've got about it. I do know that by the time the American influx happened, the gold rush, just before the gold rush, especially after, I mean, in some ways, the Indians and the Mexicans were kind of in it together at that point. They'd worked out a way to work together, and then they then collectively had to deal with this, probably from their perspective, an invasion. I don't know. So I think in some ways they kind of hunkered down together and worked it out. And I want to understand more of that too. I've got some books in my queue that I need to get to and all of that. And a lot of this too, I think, is going to be some basic research over at the Bancroft Library and things like that.
No, I'm interested in that period too. So I think it's I'd like to see what you find eventually.
I forgot to mention one thing on the security side is one thing our group has paid will be close to $30,000 by the time it's all done. Before we own the building, is a sophisticated security and fire alarm system up there with video and motion detection and all that sort of stuff. And those and we had to basically pony that up front because it had to go in when the wiring's getting redone and all of that. We couldn't just sort of take ownership and then retrofit it. So we just passed the fire alarm inspection last week, where that was a non-trivial concern. And so now we just need the cameras to go up, and the final doors aren't on the building yet. So once those are on, get the door sensors on and all that. It is a nice neighborhood. We've got neighbors that can look right across the street. So I really hope that stops to be an issue. It's, it'd have to be a destination vandalism spot. And I don't think it quite lives up to that anymore.
Yeah, that's true. So I think that's actually it for us. This has been a great program for me to be a part of. So I certainly want to thank you for bringing this to us. I'm sure our viewers enjoyed it all. And I want to thank all of everybody for viewing this morning. If you missed any of our earlier programs, including this one, you can find them by visiting the museum's website at museumsrv.org. Today's program will appear early next week. Join us on Thursday, December 21st, which is our next virtual program at 11:30, when we do some show and tell. The San Ramon Valley branch of the Southern Pacific Railroad Historical Model Railroad Group, long name, will tell us of their N-scale model train layout that shows the San Ramon Valley branch line, or San Ramon branch line, from the Bay Point Rail Yard through the cities of Concord, Oakland, Walnut Creek, Alamo, Danville, Osage, and ending in San Ramon. Then you get to come to the museum and see the real N-scale layout in operation from the Friday after Thanksgiving to the day before New Year's Eve. The museum will also be decked out in holiday fare, featuring miniatures, and as I said, all decked out for the holidays. If you want these programs if you like these programs and want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's homepage, museumsrv.org. I will join Kent in saying they need donations, we need donations, they need volunteers, so do we. So pick one of us and donate and volunteer and help these places that need the good help. So again, thank you, Kent. Thanks for bringing this to our attention. I expect to come out and see this place physically myself one of these days. And I hope that everybody enjoyed today's presentation. Stay safe. Thank you for watching. And I hope everybody has a good Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Dan. It's really my pleasure. Bye,
it was fun. Thanks.